The echoes of Springfield. Springfield is one of Bermuda's most quietly powerful historic places. Set along Somerset Road in Sandys Parish, its limestone walls, courtyard, outbuildings, and surrounding landscape hold more than 3 centuries of Bermudian memory. This is a story of land and family, but also of labor, slavery, survival, conservation, community use, and renewal. To understand Springfield is to look beyond the beauty of the old house and listen for the many lives that shaped it. Good day, folks. I am standing on Somerset Road in Sandys Parish, Bermuda, outside number 29. The road moves past me in the ordinary rhythm of the West End: buses, scooters, church bells, neighbors calling across walls, and the saltier moving in from the Great Sound. If I were not looking for it, I might pass Springfield without understanding what I had just seen. It is a long, low, whitewashed limestone house, quiet at first glance, but the more I look, the more it begins to speak. The ear tastes faintly of salt and warm stone. I hear tires whisper over the road, a scooter engine fading toward Somerset Village, and the dry scrape of leaves along a wall. The limestone seems to hold the day's heat in its face. Even before I step inside, Springfield feels less like an object and more like a place still breathing through its walls. I have come here because Springfield is not simply an old house. It is one of Bermuda's most important surviving early Georgian plantation complexes. Its present limestone core dates to the 1740s, but the story of the land reaches back to the 1600s, when Edward Hinson was already associated with this property by 1662. Before the stone house we see today, a substantial 2-story post and plaster house with a thatched roof stood on this site. Over time, the property passed through the Hinson family inheritance into the Gilbert line, and for generations, Springfield was occupied, enlarged, worked, repaired, inherited, adapted, and remembered. I want to tell that full story, not as a postcard, but as a documentary journey through land, labor, family, slavery, business, community, conservation, and memory. For the next 80 minutes, I am going to move slowly. I am going to let the property unfold in time rather than rush through it as a list of owners. I will begin with the 17th century landholding of Edward Hinson. I will follow Mary Hinson into the Gilbert family. I will stand inside the 1740s limestone house built by Mary and Ephraim Gilbert. I will look directly at the slave quarters, the kitchen, the courtyard, the buttery, the cellar, the garden, the woodland, and the road. And I will ask the same question again and again: who lived here? Who worked here? Who profited here? Who suffered here? And who claimed Springfield in the end? Long pause, the wilderness, and Edward Hinson. To understand Springfield, I have to begin before the house. I have to imagine Sandys Parish before the road, before the library, before the community center, before the restored porch and the photographed buttery. In the 17th century, this land was dense with Bermuda cedar and palmetto, thin soil over limestone, and access to the water that made the West End strategic. Bermuda's early economy had already begun shifting away from failing tobacco agriculture and toward the sea. Land here mattered because it could feed a household, support livestock and gardens, provide timber, and connect a family to maritime work. I tried to hear that earlier landscape: cedar boughs shifting in the wind, palmetto fronds rattling like paper, insects rising from the scrub, and waves striking the nearby shore in a steady low pulse. The soil would have been thin and stubborn underfoot. The limestone would have flashed white through the earth. Every cleared patch would have taken effort, and every path toward the water would have mattered. The first documented European owner associated with this estate was Edward Hinson. He was on the property by 1662, and when I say that name aloud here, I am naming the beginning of the surviving documentary trail. Hinson's occupation places Springfield in the earliest phase of Bermuda's colonial settlement. It also reminds me that the Springfield we see today did not appear suddenly in the 1740s. It grew out of an earlier Hinson holding, an earlier house, and an earlier landscape of clearing, planting, building, and inheritance. I pause over the record. By 1662, Edward Hinson is recorded on this land. Before the present stone house, a substantial 2-story post and plaster house with a thatched roof stood here. 17th century Sandys was rugged, but it was strategic. Mangrove Bay and Eddie's Harbor placed this land near working water, not just workable soil. This was not only about farming, it was about maritime access. Hinson's occupation helped establish the early boundaries of what would eventually become the Springfield estate. I begin with Edward Hinson because his name is where this surviving trail starts to sharpen. He is believed to have been born around 1600 in Barbados, in the early world of English colonial expansion, where tobacco and sugar were already reshaping land, labor, and ambition. Before 1653, he made his way north to Bermuda and settled in the western part of the island, then known as Sandys Tribe and now Sandys Parish. There he entered the planter class, married Elizabeth Milner, daughter of John Milner, and raised a family whose names would spread through Bermuda's records. Cornelius, Nicholas, Benjamin, Daniel, and other descendants who carried the Hinson name beyond one household and into the island's wider story. By 1662, I find Hinson firmly established in Somerset Village. In the Richard Norwood Land Survey of 1662 to 1663, he appears as the master of a substantial estate. That detail matters to me because it fixes Springfield's earliest known documentary presence in the landscape. It tells me that before the Georgian stone house, before the enclosed courtyard, before the buttery and the surviving slave quarters, there was already a recognized holding here, land cleared, claimed, worked, and measured. On this plot, I imagine Hinson's first Springfield not as the grand limestone mansion that stands today, but as an earlier Bermudian homestead, a two-story post and plaster house, framed in timber, filled with plastered material, and roofed with thatch. From that house, Hinson managed land, household production, livestock, and agriculture, while positioning his family within the small but powerful network of 17th century Bermudian landholders. Edward Hinson died in 1676 in Somerset, Sandys Parish. After his death, the land did not disappear from the family story. It passed through descendants, wills, marriages, and inheritance until, in the 1740s, Mary Hinson and her husband Ephraim Gilbert replaced the older thatched homestead with the main stone block of Springfield. When I look at the house today, I see that change as more than an architectural upgrade. I see one generation of timber and thatch giving way to another generation of limestone, wealth, permanence, and power. Through Hinson's early settlement, Springfield began a long chain of family occupations. The estate remained connected to the Hinson, Gilbert, and Hunt descendants for nearly 300 years until it was acquired for preservation in 1966. I pause on that span of time because few houses hold such a long, continuous family thread. At Springfield, the land remembers the Hinson beginning, the Gilbert transformation, the Hunt inheritance, and the public preservation that came later. The spread of the Hinson name across Bermuda reads to me like a map of 17th century colonial land division. After Edward's death, his sons used wills, marriages, and property transfers to extend the family's reach beyond Sandys. What began as a thatched homestead in the West End gradually became part of a wider family network stretching into Pembroke, Southampton, Port Royal, and St. George's. Following Edward Hinson's death in 1676, I can trace how the family used property, marriage, and inheritance to secure its place in Bermuda. The sons and later descendants did not simply inherit land. They organized it, divided it, transferred it, and used it to establish family branches across the island. Springfield remained the emotional and architectural center of that story, but the Hinson name traveled outward from it. Benjamin Hinson remained rooted in Sandys Parish and appears to have held close to the core Springfield properties. Through marriage to Sarah Sherlock, he strengthened ties with another established local family. His branch helped keep the homestead within the family line, and through his daughter Mary Hinson, the property would move into the Gilbert story. Mary becomes the bridge. Hinson land on one side, Gilbert inheritance on the other. Then I turned to Captain Cornelius Hinson. His path carried the family name beyond Sandys into Pembroke Parish and Southampton, including Port Royal. As a planter and mariner, he represents the mixed world of Bermudian wealth. Land on one hand, sea on the other. His wills and deeds show a deliberate strategy of passing property to sons and building a seafaring family presence across the central parishes. Through him, the Hinson name becomes not only a West End name, but a Bermudian one. Nicholas Hinson carries the family story eastward. Through his marriage to Sarah Tucker and his descendants' later roles in civic, medical, and military life, the family name became embedded in other parts of Bermuda. This matters because Springfield was never isolated from the island around it. The house in Somerset was one node in a wider network of kinship, property, profession, and influence. I picture Edward Hinson's first house as sturdy but vulnerable, a post and plaster structure, timber framed, packed with local material, and roofed with layered palmetto thatch. It belonged to an earlier Bermuda, before limestone became the dominant language of permanence. By the early 1740s, Bermuda itself was changing. Cedar had been widely used in shipbuilding, storms had exposed the weakness of thatch, and stone offered durability, status, and security. Mary Hinson and Captain Ephraim Gilbert replaced the old house with a Bermudian vernacular Georgian mansion of thick limestone. In that transformation, I hear the island turning from timber to stone, from early settlement to established colonial wealth. The new layout became an enclosed compound. I see the detached kitchen first, set apart to control heat, smoke, and fire. Then I see the arched stone buttery with its steep pyramidal roof, built to keep milk, meat, and perishable goods cool before refrigeration. These were not decorative details. They were technologies of survival, status, and household control. Hinson eventually left the property to his daughter Mary. Through Mary, the land entered the Gilbert story. That transfer matters because Springfield would remain in an unbroken family line from the late 1600s until 1966, when it was purchased by the Historical Monuments Trust, the predecessor of the Bermuda National Trust. In other words, this is not a property with a scattered ownership story. It is a house where lineage, inheritance, occupation, and memory run like a long seam through Bermuda's history. I pause on Mary's name because the property's passage through her is one of the turning points in this story. Too often, old houses are narrated only through male surnames, but here Mary Hinson is the hinge. Through inheritance, marriage, and family continuity, she connects the Hinson holding to the Gilbert estate. Without Mary, Springfield's later story cannot be told honestly. By the turn of the 18th century, Bermuda had largely abandoned the plow for the sail. The islanders discovered that the endemic Bermuda cedar was light, buoyant, resistant to marine bores, and incredibly strong. It was the perfect material for shipbuilding. The Gilberts were quick to capitalize on this maritime revolution. In the early 18th century, the property came into the hands of Mary Hinson and her husband Ephraim Gilbert. In the 1740s, Ephraim and Mary built the main part of the stone house that stands today. I imagine the site then, quarrying limestone, burning lime, cutting cedar, raising walls, and shaping a home that announced status and permanence. The first stone phase included a range of rooms in the wing, later fronted by the long veranda, with a hall, entrance, passage, chamber, and a large cellar beneath the front rooms. I imagine the work by sound and sensation, chisels biting into limestone, lime smoke stinging the eyes, cedar sap clinging to hands, rope fibers rough against palms, and sweat drying white with dust. The house rose out of physical strain. Each wall carried the pressure of bodies lifting, cutting, hauling, burning, mixing, and obeying. This is where I slow the listener down. I let the sound of stone being cut sit beneath the narration. I imagine lime dust on clothing, cedar shavings underfoot, heat rising from the yard, and the weight of each block lifted into place. A house like Springfield was not built by romance. It was built by skilled labor, family ambition, and a colonial system that turned human beings into property. They built it using local materials, Bermuda limestone excavated straight from the quarries on or near the site, held together by a mortar made of burnt lime and sand. The design was early Georgian. It featured a symmetrical facade, small paned windows designed to withstand Atlantic gales, and a steeply pitched roof designed to catch every precious drop of rainwater. But I cannot describe this construction as if it were only a matter of craftsmanship and taste. The house was built within a slave society. The limestone was quarried, carried, cut, and finished by people whose labor was coerced. The cedar was worked by hands whose names survive only in fragments, if at all. From the beginning, Springfield was both a family home and a working property, and its domestic comfort depended on enslaved labor, maritime wealth, and the daily service of people denied freedom. After Ephraim Gilbert's death, around 1769, Springfield passed to his eldest son, Thomas Gilbert. Thomas followed his father in public and militia life, serving as captain of the Sandys militia. By 1788, Springfield was valued at £500, the second highest valuation in the parish. That figure tells me something important. By the late 18th century, Springfield was not merely a residence, it was a valuable estate, a business asset, a center of family authority, and a property embedded in Bermuda's maritime and agricultural economy. I read the valuation slowly. By 1788, Springfield was valued at £500, the second highest valuation in Sandys Parish. That figure is not just a number. In documentary terms, it is a sound cue. It is the sound of wealth being measured. It is the sound of land, rooms, livestock, outbuildings, cultivated ground, stored food, inherited privilege, and enslaved labor being converted into value. When I hear £500, I hear the economic system beneath the whitewash. When most people hear the word plantation, they think of the American South. They think of endless fields of cotton or tobacco stretching to the horizon with a grand mansion isolated far from the fields. But Bermuda is an island of micro-landscapes. A Bermuda plantation was compact, dense, and intimate in its physical layout. At Springfield, this intimacy was structural. I walked the grounds as a listener would walk through sound. The main house first, then the courtyard, then the outbuildings. The late 18th century expansion added the enclosed courtyard, a separate kitchen, slave houses, additional rooms, and the unusual smooth-roofed buttery. The buttery is one of the most distinctive surviving buildings on the property, a cool storage and preparation space that speaks to food, service, preservation, and household management in a humid island climate. In my mind, the courtyard is never silent. I hear iron pots shifting over flame, water sloshing in buckets, shoes on worn stone, shutters knocking in a gust, and voices lowered when someone passes too close. The air carries smoke, stored food, damp limestone, cut cedar, and the faint sourness of laundry water. This was not a picturesque courtyard. It was a working space crowded with heat, labor, supervision, and survival. The buttery deserves its own moment. On an island where heat, humidity, storms, and isolation shape daily life, food storage was survival. Thick walls and careful siting helped keep provisions cool. Drinks and food could be prepared and held there. The building was practical, but it was also part of the social order. Food moved from garden, sea, market, kitchen, and storage into the dining spaces of the main house through the labor of people whose names were rarely recorded. The main house sits at the center. But as the Gilbert family's wealth grew throughout the 1700s, the estate expanded into a complex. They constructed an enclosed courtyard. To the side of the main house sits the buttery, a distinctive square building with a high pyramid-shaped roof. Its thick limestone walls kept perishable goods cool in the brutal subtropical summer heat. But look closer at the courtyard. Bordering it are the structures that truly define Springfield's history, the kitchen wing and the surviving slave quarters. What makes Springfield uniquely valuable and uniquely haunting is that the slave quarters survived. In many sites across the wider Atlantic world, structures like these were lost. In Bermuda, stone buildings and hurricane realities preserved more than anyone may have intended. The quarters at Springfield show the spatial closeness in which enslaved people lived beside those who held power over them. Who were the people who lived in these stone quarters? Through colonial registries, parish records, and the work of local historians, I can begin to piece together names, occupations, and fragments of lives. At Springfield, occupation meant more than ownership. The Hinsons occupied and held the land in the 17th century. Mary Hinson and Ephraim Gilbert occupied and transformed it in the 18th. Thomas Gilbert and later generations inherited, enlarged, and maintained it. Enslaved people lived and worked there as domestic servants, cooks, washers, gardeners, craftspeople, sailors, pilots, shipwrights, blacksmiths, laborers, and children growing up under bondage. Later, after emancipation, paid workers, tenants, caretakers, librarians, school staff, community organizers, preservation workers, gardeners, tradespeople, and visitors all became part of Springfield's living story. Because this is a documentary, I do not want to flatten those people into a single category. Some may have cooked, some may have gardened, some may have worked with cedar, some may have gone to sea. Some may have cleaned rooms, washed clothing, carried water, tended children, cared for animals, repaired tools, hauled stone, or learned trades under compulsion. Their labor made Springfield possible. Their lives were not background scenery. They were central to the estate's operation. Because Springfield was a compact island plantation rather than a sprawling cotton or tobacco estate, labor here had to be intensely diversified. The work could not be divided into one simple category of field labor. A single estate in Sandys Parish needed people who could build, sail, repair, cook, wash, nurse, cultivate, preserve food, tend animals, carry water, mend tools, and respond to storms. The daily rhythm of Springfield depended on specialized knowledge. For enslaved men at Springfield and in the surrounding maritime world of Somerset, labor often reached beyond the yard and out onto the water. Men could be shipwrights, carpenters, blacksmiths, caulkers, pilots, sailors, and mariners. Their hands shaped Bermuda cedar into vessels, repaired hulls, sealed seams, worked iron, set rigging, and guided sloops through reefs, channels, and harbors. Nearby Ely's Harbor and Mangrove Bay were not just picturesque anchorages. They were working maritime spaces, and the labor tied to them made Bermuda's economy move. I imagine the sound of that work, cedar boards being planed, a mallet striking a caulking iron, pitch warming in a pot, a blacksmith's hammer ringing against metal, a sail being hauled into place, a pilot calling instructions as the sloop slips out toward deeper water. Bermuda's famous cedar sloops were admired for their speed and durability, but at Springfield, I want to hear the labor inside that reputation. I want to hear the enslaved and bound workers whose skill made the vessels possible. Women's labor was just as specialized and just as essential. In the open hearth kitchen, heat was constant and punishing. Food had to be prepared without the convenience of modern stoves, refrigeration, running water, or safe distance from smoke and flame. Enslaved women cooked, washed, cleaned, carried water, tended children, and managed the domestic systems that allowed the main house to function. Some acted as sick nurses, caring for children, adults, elderly people, and one another in a time when illness could spread quickly and medical help was limited. I can almost feel the kitchen heat pressing against the skin, smoke coating cloth, ash settling on the floor, steam rising from pots, and the sharp smell of onions, herbs, fish, or salted meat. The work would have begun before the house fully woke and continued after the main rooms had quieted. In that heat, skill was not optional, it was survival. There was textile work too, mending, washing, drying, folding, and weaving or preparing cloth for household use. Laundry alone could consume whole days. Fabric had to be soaked, scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, wrung, carried, dried, and repaired. These tasks rarely appear as grand history, but they were the labor that kept a household presentable, clothed, and operating. And then there were the terrace plots. Bermuda did not offer endless fields. Bermuda did not offer endless fields. It offered pockets of workable soil, small garden beds, terraces, and enclosed spaces carved out of limestone and cedar growth. At Springfield, enslaved women and men cultivated food crops that could sustain the household: onions, arrowroot, sweet potatoes, herbs, and provisions suited to island conditions. Every small plot mattered, every harvest mattered. In a compact island estate, survival depended on making limited land produce as much as possible. So when I speak of Springfield as a plantation, I do not mean a single crop stretched across a horizon. I mean a crowded economy of skills. I mean a kitchen fire and a shipyard rhythm. I mean a garden terrace and a laundry yard. I mean blacksmithing, caulking, sailing, nursing, weaving, washing, harvesting, carrying, mending, cooking, and waiting. I mean people forced to master many forms of labor because the estate, the family, and the island economy depended on them. The property's business life was also layered. Springfield was connected to household production, small-scale agriculture, livestock, food storage, cedar work, maritime enterprise, militia status, and later public and community use. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Bermuda moved through shipping, onion export, tourism, education, and heritage preservation, Springfield's use changed with the island. It was never only a private house. It was a place where people lived, worked, stored goods, cooked, learned, gathered, restored, rented, interpreted, and remembered. And then there are the records, wills, inventories, registries, documents that can be painful to read because they reduce human lives to entries on a page. I would read them plainly, without drama, and then I would stop speaking for a moment. The language of wills and registries can be brutal because it records people as possessions. I do not dramatize it for shock. I read it plainly, and then I leave a pause. The pause is part of the truth. This proximity meant there was no privacy. Enslaved families lived just feet from the back door of the main house. They could hear the Gilbert family dining, entertaining, and sleeping. Conversely, the Gilberts lived with the constant, hyper-vigilant awareness of the people they held in bondage. It was a landscape of forced intimacy and immense psychological tension. But captivity does not mean complacency. Because Bermuda's economy was maritime, enslaved Bermudians possessed a unique form of leverage, mobility. Enslaved men from Sandys Parish often formed the crews of privateers and merchant sloops. They went to sea, encountered free people of color in Caribbean ports, and brought radical ideas of liberty back to the docks of Somerset. The sea was both a place of forced labor and a pipeline of information. Enslaved mariners knew how to navigate. They knew the weather. They knew the ports. That knowledge made Bermuda's enslaved population connected, skilled, mobile, and deeply aware of worlds beyond the island. At Springfield, this manifested in quiet daily acts of resistance, withholding labor, preserving African cultural traditions in the shadows of the courtyard, and the constant push for autonomy. The Gilberts knew their wealth hung by a thread that would face its ultimate test as the 19th century dawned. I move into the decades leading up to Emancipation Day, and then into the long transformation of Springfield from private colonial property into a place of public memory, community use, retail life, conservation, and renewal. I am listening for a different sound, church bells, voices, footsteps moving away from old legal categories and into uncertain freedom. The date is August 1st, 1834. Across Bermuda, slavery legally ended. Unlike many other British colonies, Bermuda did not impose the apprenticeship system. Freedom came immediately, though equality did not. I bring the listener into the courtyard and let the bells ring longer than feels comfortable. Then I cut the music completely. Emancipation is often described as a clean historical line, but for people living at a property like Springfield, freedom arrived with urgent practical questions: housing, wages, family separation, contracts, church membership, movement, respect, and the right to define one's own future. I imagine the morning air after emancipation, the same stone, the same paths, the same roofs, but a different weight inside every breath. The sea would still move beyond the village. Chickens might still scratch at the yard. Doors would still open and close. Yet the law had shifted, and with it the meaning of every footstep across the property. Unlike the colonies in the West Indies, where the British government implemented a multi-year apprenticeship system that effectively prolonged slavery, Bermuda's local legislature chose immediate, total emancipation. On that Friday morning, over 4,000 enslaved Bermudians became legally free. At Springfield, the air must have felt entirely different. Imagine the scene in the courtyard. The Gilbert family no longer legally owned the bodies of the people sleeping in the quarters. For the newly freed people of Springfield, emancipation brought immediate pressing questions. Where do we live? How do we feed our families? How do we build a community when we have been denied property for generations? After emancipation, Springfield's occupation changed. The Gilbert family continued to live there, but the people who had once been enslaved were no longer property. Some freed Bermudians remained in Sandys Parish, working for wages, renting land, continuing maritime trades, building churches and families, and pushing for autonomy in a society still structured by race, property, and power. Springfield shifted from a slave-dependent plantation household to a property managed through hired labor, tenancy, caretaking, and inherited family residence. Springfield's post-emancipation story is not a disappearance story. The people who had labored in and around the estate did not vanish when the legal category of slavery ended. Their descendants remained part of Sandys Parish, part of Bermuda's maritime world, part of church life, part of education, part of wage work, and part of the island's continuing struggle over dignity and land. Throughout the Victorian era and into the early 20th century, Springfield stood as a silent witness to a changing Bermuda. The island was pivoting again, this time from shipping to winter tourism and specialized agriculture, exporting the famous Bermuda onion to the markets of New York. Generation after generation of the Gilbert and Hunt families occupied, modified, repaired, and used Springfield. The house expanded slowly into a more substantial property. Rooms changed, verandas appeared, kitchens, outbuildings, gardens, and yards adapted to new forms of domestic life. In the 20th century, restorations altered some early features, and later architectural and archaeological investigations would have to read the building carefully to understand what survived and what had been changed. Here, the pace widens again. The 19th century becomes the 20th. The property is still occupied, but its meaning is changing. Bermuda is changing too. Transport, tourism, schools, churches, shops, family networks, and public institutions are reshaping daily life. Springfield remains physically old, but socially it is not still. It keeps being adapted by each generation that passes through it. The longevity of the Gilberts at Springfield is extraordinary. To have a single family line connected to a major property from the late 1600s into the mid 20th century created a long paper trail. It also helped keep the estate's physical footprint remarkably intact when so many other old properties were altered, subdivided, or lost. By the mid 20th century, however, the burden of maintaining a massive historic limestone complex had become too much for private individuals. The world was modernizing, and Springfield was at risk of falling into disrepair or being lost to commercial development. The final Gilbert owners realized that the property's future lay not in private hands, but in the hands of the public. In 1966, Springfield's ownership changed dramatically. The Historical Monuments Trust purchased the property from the family line that had held it since the late 1600s. That organization later became part of the Bermuda National Trust preservation story. For me, this is the turning point where Springfield moved from private inheritance into public responsibility. I linger on that sentence. The estate descended in an unbroken family line from its first owner in the late 1600s until the Historical Monuments Trust purchased it in 1966. The preservation mission was not only to save a handsome old house, it was to protect a full historic complex: main house, courtyard, kitchen, buttery, slave quarters, gardens, and landscape. Later, in 1973, the adjacent Gilbert Nature Reserve came under National Trust care, adding protected woodland to the story of the estate. Springfield did not become a sealed museum. It became useful again. For years, the main house served as the Sandys Public Library. Children, students, parents, and readers came through the old rooms to borrow books. Later, it served as the Somerset Community Center. The property also housed a nursery school and community activities. In those years, Springfield was occupied not by one family, but by a whole community, using the house for learning, care, meetings, and everyday public life. This is one of the most powerful reversals in Springfield's modern life. A house once organized around hierarchy, ownership, and restricted access became a place where children read books, families attended programs, and neighbors gathered. The old rooms did not stop carrying difficult history, but they began to carry new public meanings. By the early 21st century, the buildings needed serious care. Reports described decaying exterior millwork, an unsafe veranda, damaged roofs, and the need to remove unsympathetic modern additions. Preservation works repaired roofs and walls, refinished shutters and millwork, restored cedar features, and explored new uses to keep the property alive. The two-story neighboring building was planned as a one-bedroom apartment and studio, and the rear structure, formerly associated with the slave quarters, was planned as a two-bedroom rental home. In this modern chapter, occupation includes preservation staff, carpenters, gardeners, tenants, researchers, and visitors. Then, in 2018, Springfield entered another modern chapter. The last known business to operate from the property was a retail business led by Burnett and Michael Ford. They took over Springfield and transformed part of the property into a household and hardware store called Bargain Hunters. What began as a practical retail space became something warmer and more personal, a place where shelves of household goods, tools, hardware, and everyday bargains turned the old estate into a familiar stop for local residents. I imagine the sound of that chapter differently from the earlier ones. The front door opening, customers calling hello, keys being cut or tools being discussed, small purchases placed on a counter, neighbors exchanging news before heading back onto Somerset Road. Bargain hunters became successful not only because it was a store, it became part of the Somerset community itself. Another example of Springfield being adapted, occupied, and made useful by the people around it. In that chapter, Springfield smelled not of lime smoke or open hearth cooking, but of cardboard boxes, metal tools, household cleaners, paint, rubber, keys, and new stock being unpacked. The counter became a meeting place. The old walls listened to small transactions, practical advice, laughter, complaints about the weather, and the everyday music of neighbors recognizing one another. When I step out toward the reserve, the house gives way to trees. The Gilbert Nature Reserve covers about 5 acres of woodland, and the wider Springfield property and neighboring reserve together form a significant protected landscape in Sandys. Here, the story loops back to the beginning: cedar, shade, birdsong, and the memory of what Bermuda's vegetation looked like before centuries of clearing and building. The change in sound is immediate. Road noise softens behind me. Leaves take over. The reserve gives me bird song, dry twigs underfoot, the green smell of shade, and the resinous scent of cedar. After so much stone, the trees feel like a different archive, one written in bark, roots, seeds, and light. The reserve is not an afterthought to the house. It changes the ending of the episode. It allows Springfield's story to widen from architecture into ecology. Bermuda cedar, woodland paths, birds, shade, and the railway trail all remind me that heritage is not only built in stone, sometimes it grows back leaf by leaf. Managed by the National Trust, this reserve is a living laboratory of Bermuda's ecological history. It contains mature stands of native and endemic flora, offering a glimpse of what the island looked like before Edward Hinson first cleared his plots in the 1660s. But Springfield's ultimate modern role is cultural. Every year, it serves as a central anchor for events like the Emancipation Cup match walkabout. When people walk through Springfield during emancipation celebrations, they are doing something powerful. They are taking a space shaped by colonial hierarchy and filling it with remembrance, education, community, and joy. They honor the ancestors who built those walls, and they insist that the past not be hidden behind the beauty of the stone. As I leave Springfield, I do not leave with one simple story. I leave with a layered one. Edward Hinson was on this land by 1662. Mary Hinson carried it into the Gilbert family. Ephraim and Mary Gilbert built the main stone house in the 1740s. Thomas Gilbert inherited it after Ephraim and helped define its 18th century status. Enslaved Bermudians lived and worked here, giving the house its material reality while being denied freedom. After emancipation, paid workers, tenants, and descendants of a changing Bermuda shaped its next life. The Gilbert and Hunt families held it for generations. The Historical Monuments Trust purchased it in 1966. The Bermuda National Trust preserved it. The library, nursery school, community center, restoration crews, tenants, visitors, the retail life of bargain hunters, and the Gilbert Nature Reserve made it public. The next time you travel down Somerset Road, slow down at number 29. Listen closely to the wind rustling through the cedar trees in the reserve. If you listen long enough, you can still hear the echoes of Springfield. And maybe that is why Springfield still matters. It forces me to hold contradiction. It is beautiful and troubling. It is domestic and political. It is private and public. It is a house, a workplace, a plantation, a library, a community center, a rental property, a restoration project, a nature reserve, and a place of memory. To tell Springfield properly, I have to let all of those truths remain in the room together. For an 80-minute documentary, I let the silence matter. I let footsteps across the courtyard last a few seconds longer. I let the names breathe. I let the listener understand that Springfield is not frozen in the 1740s. It is a continuing Bermudian place, occupied first as land, then as home, plantation, workplace, inheritance, library, school, community center, retail store, rental, reserve, and site of remembrance. Springfield's story begins with land, water, and early colonial settlement. Edward Hinson was associated with this property by 1662, and the first known house on the site was a two-story post and plaster building with a thatched roof. Through Mary Hinson, the property entered the Gilbert family, and in the 1740s, Mary and Ephraim Gilbert built the main limestone house that still anchors the estate. The estate was not only a family residence, it was a compact island plantation and working property shaped by maritime labor, household production, agriculture, food storage, skilled trades, and coerced work. Enslaved Bermudians built, cooked, washed, nursed, cultivated, sailed, repaired, carried, and preserved the daily life of the estate while living under bondage. Their labor is central to Springfield's meaning. After emancipation in 1834, Springfield continued to change. The Gilbert and Hunt family line remained connected to the property for generations, but the estate's purpose shifted over time from private inheritance to public responsibility. In 1966, the Historical Monuments Trust purchased Springfield, and later stewardship by the Bermuda National Trust helped preserve the house, outbuildings, slave quarters, gardens, and landscape. In modern life, Springfield became useful to the Somerset community in new ways. As a library, nursery school, community center, preserved historic site, rental and restoration property, and later the home of bargain hunters, the household and hardware business opened by Burnett and Michael Ford in 2018. Together with the Gilbert Nature Reserve, Springfield now stands as a place where architecture, ecology, labor history, family memory, public use, and community identity meet. Here is a short note from Burnett and Michael Ford. When we took over Springfield in 2018 and opened Bargain Hunters, we wanted it to be more than a store. We wanted it to be a place where people felt welcome, where Somerset families could find what they needed, and where the old property could continue serving the community in a new way. Springfield has always carried history, but for us, it also carried neighbors, conversations, hard work, and pride. If this story has moved you, I invite you to do three things. First, learn the history of the places you pass every day, especially the places that seem ordinary from the road. Second, support the organizations, historians, preservationists, and community members who protect Bermuda's built and natural heritage. And third, if you visit Springfield or walk through Somerset, pause long enough to listen to the stone, the cedar, the road, and the people whose lives made this place what it is. Share this episode with someone who loves Bermuda history. Leave a comment with the local places you believe deserve to be remembered. Subscribe for more stories from Island Chronicles, and keep asking what the old walls, roads, gardens, and shorelines still have to tell us. As this episode closes, I leave Springfield with the sound of Somerset Road still behind me, the soft rush of tires, the fading hum of a scooter, the call of a bird from the reserve, and the wind moving through cedar branches. I carry the smell of warm limestone, old wood, shaded earth, and salt air. I think of footsteps crossing the courtyard, hands shaping cedar, smoke rising from the kitchen, pages turning in the library, customers greeting one another at Bargain Hunters, and leaves whispering over the paths of the Gilbert Nature Reserve. If Springfield's story has opened your eyes to the hidden history around us, please take a moment to like this episode, subscribe to Island Chronicles, and leave a comment below. Tell us which Bermudian place, family story, old road, neighborhood, or building you believe deserves to be remembered next. Every like, share, comment, and subscription helps keep Bermuda's stories alive and helps more people discover the voices, places, and memories that shaped our island. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for helping us honor the echoes of Springfield. Thank you for listening to this special episode of Island Chronicles. This episode was written and produced by Ford Production Company. Special thanks to the Bermuda National Trust and to the local historians, preservationists, and community members whose work keeps Springfield's story alive.